look at Broadway, it's super hard to replicate. I mean, not Broadway. Yo-ho, thanks for joining us. It's time to sit down, put in those earbuds so as not to disturb the neighbors, and join us for another episode of Off Book, a podcast where we talk all about Broadway, movies, TV shows, and anything else that we want to geek out about. I'm Marc Stoufer III.
And I'm Ashley Szurna. Today we're going to be talking about the differences between original, regional, and school productions of Broadway musicals, and why non-original versions of the show often seem to be missing something when compared to professional counterparts.
None of us have seen shows on Broadway, but we've seen throw shots, and we've listened to cast albums and things, and we've both seen regional shows, and we've been a part of a lot of school productions. And it always seems like this obviously is not how it was intended to be performed. And I think that there were a lot of trademarks of that, because when you look at Broadway, it's super hard to replicate. I mean, not Broadway, especially if you look at a show like Hamilton or even Beetlejuice. I mean, especially Beetlejuice. I want to see what the set for a high school production of Beetlejuice is going to look like, because Beetlejuice was having a hard time even finding another theater to move to after they were evicted from the Winter Garden, because their set was created specifically for the Winter Garden Theater. So there are so many things, from the set to just the music and the complexity of it, to the casting and how talented the actors have to be. The script is often more adult, so there are a whole bunch of things that don't seem super bad until you have to start trying to figure out how to adapt it to something else, and I think that makes it super complicated.
Mm-hmm. Like, if you look at like Hamilton with the rotating floors, like everywhere the travel groups would have to go, they'd have to also input those floors.
Yeah. And
that's obviously a big challenge, because some theaters might not have the budget to be able to do that, or their stage just can't do it.
Yeah. And the Newsies set has a whole bunch of platforms that rotate around, and they keep stacking and unstacking and rotating, and some theaters can do that and a lot can't. Not to mention that the caliber of talent that they have on Broadway is obviously going to be different in most cases than the talent that you have on somewhere other than Broadway. So if you write a song specifically for Jeremy Jordan to sing, and you try to get Steve from Illinois, no offense Steve, to sing it, it might be very hard for him to hit it, so you might have to change that.
And when you look at, both of us have had our fair shares of school productions.
Yes.
So when you try to take a big show and make it into a school show, like we did Grease a couple of years ago, we did High School Musical,
which are basically the same show.
Yeah, they all have certain aspects that are extremely hard for a school to put on, because obviously our stage is not going to be as big as a Broadway stage, or even theaters. And so we have to make these different props are inputted in the show, but we have to make sure it also fits our stage, and it can't be too big. I'm never going to be able to see us do Hamilton or Beetlejuice or even Phantom of the Opera, because there's no possible way, and our budget's not there, and it's just this stage size is just too small.
Yeah, I think that the biggest difference is that Broadway shows were created to specifically fit in the budget they have. They know how much money they have up front, so they design a set that costs this much to build, and they can pay the actors this much, and they know exactly how much money they can spend and how much talent they have and what exactly they can do. And then everybody else that ever does a production of that, other than the Broadway version, is kind of stuck going, okay, we don't have that, so how do we do a $5 billion thing with $1,000? Or input your numerical value there.
Yeah, exactly. And that's just one of the challenges that a lot of these travel groups face, is some of them might not have the same budget as the original Broadway show would have had.
Right.
Or I guess has, which is why some shows aren't even traveling, because they just can't figure out a way to be able to fit all their props into a truck.
And as if a touring production weren't bad enough, you often find a community theater production of a show that I think is probably the closest thing you're going to find at Broadway outside of Broadway, or a touring company from a Broadway production. But I think that a lot of times what you notice is that community theaters try very, very hard to do the exact same thing that Broadway did, but it always looks like a significantly cheaper option, probably because it is. But I remember seeing a production of Newsies at a community theater around where I live, and the set for Newsies is kind of hard to explain via audio format. Go look up a picture later if you're interested. But it's basically these boxes, and they're on wheels, and the individual columns can move, and they can rotate, and they wheel them around the stage, and they form various different walkways and balconies and things throughout the show. So it's really a completely fluid set, and it can be whatever they need it to be. And in this production I saw, it was just kind of the entire square was sitting there the entire time, and they did have some that could rotate. They even had some that they moved, but often it was just they're sitting there at occasionally with a staircase up there. So it looks kind of like it, but it really didn't have the ability that the Broadway version did to do the same level of things. And so the entire show had to be reworked to fit a less extensive set.
Yeah. And like with our own personal experiences, let's take a look at like High School Musical. We had to build a bunch of stairs up into like a balcony. And obviously it's not going to be like High School Musical, but it's like makeshift version. That's what a lot of people have to do. They have to rework the props and everything just to be able to fit their budget and make it fit.
Yeah, and I think that even between a community theater and a school theater, you often find a lot of differences, because while community theater may have the budget to do a smaller or less expensive version of the Broadway set, most school theaters can't even do that, and so you often find that the set for a high school version of a show, or even a middle school version of the show that was on Broadway, is going to often be completely different, whereas a community theater can just create a reduced version of it. High school theaters often have to say, okay, we're starting from square one, which is why so many high school sets are just a whole bunch of furniture or a staircase and a balcony. And not that there's anything wrong with that. There are a lot of shows that have that on Broadway, if it's a smaller set, but there are a lot of shows that were written for a complicated set that end up being a much, much simpler, completely different set, just because that's all they can do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's definitely a problem that a lot of, like, theaters and schools face.
And now, an advertisement. We mentioned earlier that Broadway shows can often be very complicated and hard to adapt to other sets of limitations. And while some creative teams have the resources to make a show their own, some just don't. And unfortunately, that sometimes means that some people just can't perform certain shows. Until now. With our friends over at Professional Digital Preservation of Original Broadway Cast Performances, you can put a giant canvas in front of your stage and show your audience a digital recreation of the original production, painstakingly captured by a number of cutting-edge digital imaging coders. This is just a movie, isn't it?
That's what I was wondering. There's got to be a better way to make a production feel more original, right?
Probably. Back to the main programming. I think that's the biggest question that a lot of schools and community theaters are facing is, if we don't have the budget to pull off a Broadway version of the show, and we only have this budget, how do we create a show that doesn't feel like a cheaper version of a show that originated elsewhere? How do we make this feel like this is how it was meant to be seen? Or even we're reinterpreting the show and it's not like it was on Broadway, but it's something that feels like it was meant to be the way that it is.
Yeah. And it is obviously extremely hard to make these shows, like off-Broadway shows, seem like the originals. Like, obviously it's a big, big task that has to, like, take place. But that's just a big problem that is faced with all the off-Broadway, like, theaters and productions. It's extremely hard to make it feel original.
I think really the only way to make a show feel original when it's not is to kind of reinterpret how you're doing the show. Because if you're trying to imitate the original version of a show, it's going to feel like an imitation. Because it is. So I think what you find is productions that say, we're not going to look at what they've done on Broadway, we're not going to look at this version or that version, we're just going to look at the script and the characters, and we're going to treat it like this is the original production, like we wrote this show, and we're going to design a set, characters and costumes, and we're going to create something that feels original, because it is, because our version of the show hasn't existed yet.
Mm-hmm. And obviously it's extremely, extremely hard to make a show feel original. Like, it's just, it's hard, and a lot of times it doesn't happen. But if you go, like you were saying, like, if you go into the script with a open, like, mindset of, let's just start from scratch, this is the show we wrote, and just go in with that mindset, I feel like you could get a lot more of an original feel than you would trying to imitate an original Broadway musical.
Right. The issue, though, is that a lot of people, if they see the name Beetlejuice or Hamilton or any other Broadway musical on a poster for your local high school theater and they go to see it, they're probably expecting a version of the original Broadway production, which puts you in this weird spot, because if you do the show the way they did it originally, it's going to feel like an imitation. But if you don't do it the way they did it on Broadway, it's going to feel different, and a lot of people won't like that. So you end up in this really weird spot where you have to find somewhere that balances trying to stay in the spirit of the original so it doesn't feel like a completely different show, but also isn't so close that it feels like you're just trying poorly to imitate it. But you have enough things that are original that makes it feel different intentionally. So the things that are different just due to the nature of the medium are okay, but also not so much that it feels like,
what is this show? This is not the show that at all I know. And I don't want to see this version of the show.
Yeah, exactly. So I feel like overall it's definitely hard to make a show feel original.
Right.
When you have the basis of a show that you're already expecting, and when you have that expectation, it makes it very hard to feel original. Like, I've seen Hamilton twice, and well, I guess 3 times if you want to include Disney Plus, but one of them was in Chicago and one of them was a travel company. And obviously, like, the Chicago one is going to feel more original than the travel one did. And to me, that's what it felt like. But to me, I feel like they both did a good job of making that originality, because obviously the actors are going to say things differently than the originals, and that gives it kind of its own, like, originality.
Yeah, I think that if you try to make it the version of a show on Broadway, unless it's on Broadway or it's a show that the original creative team is directing, it's not going to feel right. But if you try too hard to go in the other direction, I feel like it's going to feel like you're trying too hard to go in the other direction. So I think that if you just give the cast and creative team of your production the ability to try new things and to reinterpret something, and not to change things if it doesn't need to be changed, but if they have an idea that is different, then to try that, so that way it doesn't feel like we're just creating something new or imitating it, but that this is just our version of something that feels like our version, because it is.
Yes, exactly.
The curtains are closing on today's episode. If you try to recreate it, it probably won't be as good.
Next week, we study franchises and what we think could have been better, and try our hand at revising their plots. Make sure you join us for that. Have a great week.